From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore.
On the Interpretation of Symbols, a lecture written by very excellent companion B.G. Patterson of Mount Morgan Royal Arch Chapter, Grand Lecturer of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Queensland in 1944. It was the curious practice of the Church of Scotland in days that are past to expect its ministers to expound the scriptures to their people with such painstaking care that one single diet of worship would not suffice for all that had to be said on any one verse. And congregations would listen to sermons on one text for week after week, and often for month after month. Kirk session records meticulously note the texts chosen and the number of Sundays devoted to each, and if their minister did not give them good measure, the people would complain to the presbytery, as did the good folk of a parish in Galloway in 1707, that he doth too often change his ordinary. It was in accordance with this custom that a Shetland minister at the beginning of the 19th century preached for 1 year and 6 months on Exodus 15, verse 27, and they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, devoting 1 Sunday to each well and 1 to each palm tree. The sermons, of course, would have been old-fashioned discourses, such as were timed with slowly trickling hourglasses to which our ancestors were addicted, and not mere 30-minute sermonettes. Presumably, the preacher took these wells and these palm trees as symbols. One cannot see how else he could have devoted so much time to them. And, if our assumption is correct, then what we have here as an example of the interpretation of symbols should really mean. We all know the great definition of Masonry, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. We carry out our ceremonies surrounded by symbols of every kind. Perhaps the only object in our lodge rooms that we may safely dismiss as having no symbolic meaning at all is the electric fan sometimes to be seen beneath the ceiling. But if we imagine that we have satisfactorily disposed of all the other objects around us, when we have named them, telling ourselves that this represents some moral virtue and some divine attribute, we certainly have not done all that is required of us. The old Shetland minister steps forward from the pages of history to tell us that not thus are symbols explained. One does not expect our lodge rooms to be turned into lecture halls in which lengthy disquisitions on these symbols will be delivered to us. There ought to be no need for that. It should suffice if we show ourselves to be truly speculative Masons, who will think out our interpretations for ourselves, step by step, in the light that is thrown upon these symbols as we advance in Masonry. Some, of course, will say that this is wrong, and that a few words of elucidation are all that we require. To their way of thinking, a little pocket glossary giving the various symbols and their respective meanings would be perfectly possible and perfectly adequate. But our symbolism is not quite so simple as this. Not only would such explanations be too brief to be of much value, but they would overlook the fact that in many cases our symbols are meant to carry several interpretations. We have a good example of this in one of the degrees of the Capitula series. In this degree, we set up objects which the ritual plainly declares to be emblematical of 3 different things, and clearly indicates at least 2 other meanings. And another example can be pointed out, to which we can refer more explicitly, for it is the symbol known to every Mason. On the Worshipful Master's apron there are insignia which differentiate him from those who sit on the floor of the lodge. In craft masonry, it is usual to call these levels, and it is as levels that the ritual explains their symbolism. But this is not all that can be said about them. One great Masonic authority has declared that they come to us from the dim and remote past, being really phallic emblems. It is an unpleasant suggestion, yet, if we see fit to belong to an institution of such incredible antiquity as Masonry, we are liable to run up against distasteful facts such as this. And we try to forget it by turning the emblems over to the form they really should take, into 3 tall crosses. The cross, we must remember, is not always a Christian symbol. The Tor cross appears repeatedly in Egyptian sculpture and paintings, where it is carried by gods and godlings as an emblem of divinity, for which reason it is sometimes called the Egyptian cross. As an ideograph derived from the hammer, gavel, or 2-headed axe, it represents power and might, while its non-Christian character has been emphasized in a curious way. It was a convention with many of the old masters who painted pictures of the crucifixion to show only one Latin or Passion cross. The thieves hang on It was perhaps only by chance that the older form of the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet and of the 19th letter of the Greek has the shape of this Egyptian cross. But from this fact, the symbol derives further meanings. For this was the mark of which Ezekiel spoke in Ezekiel 9, verses 4 to 6. Go through the midst of the city, and set a Tor upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry, slay utterly, but come not near any man upon whom is the Tor. And thus the symbol is one of mercy and acquittal. And then we can take the 3 levels of the worshipful master, which are symbols of power and might, yet also of mercy and acquittal, and therefore fittingly symbols of divinity, and group them together to represent what is so essentially the central idea of Royal Arch Masonry. This emblem looks not unlike a monogrammed TH, and this, we say, stands for Templum Ierusalemi, the Temple of Jerusalem. In order to avoid setting out explicitly the true meaning of a symbol, which conveys so much that no brief explanation can be attempted. And yet the symbol is no more than the worshipful master's 3 levels rearranged and given a new meaning. This is not all. Other examples of multiple symbols can be pointed out. The square, compasses, and the volume of the sacred law of the craft are explained differently and more fully in the ceremony of the Royal Arch. We must go to the order of the temple to learn the true meaning of the material of our aprons. The emblems at the top of the deacon's rods come into their own in the Royal Arch Mariner's degree. The first 3 degrees of Freemasonry, says Mackey, are called the symbolic degrees, notwithstanding that symbolism is to be found in all degrees. For the outstanding feature of these 3 degrees is that their mode of instruction is by symbols. They are not without legends, but the lessons that are communicated to candidates are conveyed through the medium of symbols. And the great legend of Freemasonry, which is found in the Master Mason's degree, is itself a symbol with the most abstruse and solemn signification. In other degrees we find tradition or legend taking the place of symbols, and the symbolic feature ceases to predominate. But here it is the central feature of each degree. It has been said that all we may hope to learn in Freemasonry is contained in these first 3 degrees. To this extent, the assertion is true. Many of the lessons and most of the symbols of the advanced steps of the craft are here in these degrees, but not developed to the full. He who feels perfectly capable of discerning for himself the complete interpretation of these symbols might be justified in claiming that for him all these additional steps are needless and meaningless. But who would care to make such a claim? How many of us are there who can dispense with the help that these extra degrees give us? The symbols that we see around us at our initiation into the craft convey valuable lessons to us. As we advance, these will take on fuller meanings. In some cases, they will take on new meanings which we would never have been able to grasp for ourselves. And thus, their full interpretation is gradually unfolded to us, until at length each one becomes to us, as it were, one of the palm trees of the grove of Elam.